This ugly loser boy has a chill life in a small town. He doesn't remember his past, but he lost his parents and is left to the care of this beautiful vampire until one day he is seriously attacked by a guy, and when he is about to give up, the beautiful blonde tells him that he is immortal. This is gonna be epic! The anime begins with a lot of girls greeting this boy named Negi, which is kinda like a teacher. Then he proceeds to throw the best sneeze in the history of mankind, as he leaves all the girls as God brought them into the world. We see this waifu talking, who says that everything happened 80 years ago. There we see that her name was Evangeline, who had 700 years and she was a vampire. There she tells us that eternal life is not as great as we think, saying that it obviously has good things, but that once time passes, you lose people and you have to move on. But just in that moment, the teacher who transforms into another person calls her, which the other person will be our protagonist, and this puts a smile on her. And that's when how in a change of scene we see the blonde waifu already grown up, looking all hottie. Although in that, and out of nowhere, it's attacked by these students, but quickly with a magical barrier she stops them easily. After this, the teacher, already in the classroom, says that if they managed to defeat her she would let them leave the town to reach the capital, but by the way she also tells them that they couldn't beat her in 100 years. So, GG, next game. In this all the kids claim him because she used magic, but this one tells them to shut up with a good and powerful hit. Finally, after this, we see this teacher talking with the blonde waifu whose name is Yukihime. The thing is that she tells him that she's being very severe with the boys and that she should give them a chance, to which she kind of says to think about it. But after this, we see him with his friends complaining about the teacher. In addition to talking that in the capital it is common to use magic and that there are some devices that make it even easier. The bad thing is that they are very expensive. There the main character, which his name is Touta, appears and who tells them that the only thing left for them is to train hard and defeat it to be able to reach the tower, or also called the orbital elevator. Although he quickly says goodbye to them, and there he goes to visit his deceased parents, even though the worst of all is that he doesn't even remember them. There we found out that a long time ago there had been an accident where he was the only one that he survived, and that's where the waifu Yukihime received him. We see that at first they didn't get along, but with the passage of time their relationship improved. The thing is that there in the cemetery the main character ends up seeing a kind of ghost who tells him that he was waiting for him and disappears. After this we see the main character and the waifu having dinner, where the kid quickly starts training to one day beat the waifu, but another day passes and she beats them up hard again, but this they get kicked out of the class, where the teacher appears right there and tells them that he could lend them a hand with the subject of magic. This obviously excites them and they accept, but the teacher tells them that they cannot say anything about that to Yukihime. Although right there all the kids use magic, the only one who couldn't get his magic out was the main character, which doesn't know what's going on. There, the teacher tells him that there is a way to solve it. That's how we see it with this bracelet. In a change of scene being with the waifu, he gives it to her as a gift for taking care of him for 2 years, but since he was nervous, he leaves the place quickly. This is how another day passes, and we see the waifu leaving the mini market when she is attacked by her students who leave her immobilized. Just then, the main character was on his way to the place, although out of nowhere, the teacher arrives at the place, and who out of nowhere attacks the kids and leaves them knocked out, and then attacks the waifu head-on, who tried to use magic to defend herself, but could not do it because of the bracelet. Yeah, that teacher deceived the poor kids. The teacher drops his facade of a good person and reveals the truth to us. It turns out that the guy is a hunter of immortals. He had been infiltrating the school for months. His prey hadn't let her guard down even once, but he had her served on a silver platter. A reward of more than 600 million was in his hands, with none other than the dark gospel Evangeline. There, when the man was going to finish with her, the main character arrives, who throws a blow at him, but the badass dodges it to quickly attack him and leave him without an arm. And when he was going to finish him off, the waifu intervenes. Who had managed to move, there she takes advantage of congratulate the main character for all the effort he has made, although after that, the man ends up making mincemeat. Wow man, this is brutal! There the teacher was going to leave the place, although before he was going to finish off the other students. But in that, when Touta had already given up, his was how she was going to die. She was going to leave the world without being anyone. But the voice of Yukihime wakes him up. She tells him that it's not yet time to give up, that his friends are about to be killed and he's the only one who can save them. Our protagonist didn't understand how she expected him to do it. After all, his heart had just been pierced, but Yukihime makes him realize that he is not normal and if he were a normal person, he would have died a while ago. The truth is that Yukihime turned him into an invulnerable being 2 years ago. There wasn't enough time for explanations. He had to make a quick decision. He could choose to die as a human or drink Yukihime's blood to be reborn as an immortal monster. He had only one option. He wasn't so selfish as to prioritize himself over the people he loved. Without an arm, Touta stands up and faces the scoundrel. Okay, this is getting good! Although at that moment, the villain severely wounds him again, the sprout regenerates quickly, and that's how he manages to land a powerful punch that sends him flying. But then, he collapses unconscious. When he wakes up, he finds himself lying on the lap of none other than Yukihime. Yes, the waifu was still alive, and she tells him that she had made him immortal. She also introduces herself as Evangeline, a 700-year-old vampire, and not only that, but many years ago, when his parents were about to die, they entrusted her with their final words, asking her to take care of their son. That's how she ended up making him immortal. Well, feeling somewhat guilty, the waifu apologizes to him for what she did, but he tells her not to worry, because now he will always be by her side. Isn't that beautiful, right? So, this is how Touta and Yukihime leave the village with a goal in mind, which was to reach the top of the tower. And so, their journey to the tower begins. In the meantime, the waifu tells him, "Don't think this is going to be easy, as humanity has significantly decreased in numbers over the years." Although these words bore him, Touta continues to walk, and our protagonist asks why they don't just take a bus or something. The waifu replies that it would be very dangerous, since they might encounter a hunter who could cause them a lot of trouble. And we see the protagonist looking quite cheerful, saying that he would make many friends along the way. However, Yukihime tells him not to be so happy because being immortal might not be as good as he thinks. But anyway, the protagonist goes to take a bath and reflects a bit, realizing that his friends will grow old while he remains young, and he doesn't like that very much. Just then, he encounters a girl at the location, or rather a boy, as the protagonist mistook him for a woman. Well, the boy introduces himself as Kurumaru, and our protagonist Touta tells him that together with the waifu, they were on their way to the tower. We then learn that Kurumaru had just come from the tower. Kurumaru came with a mission. He wanted to meet a woman, or rather a vampire, known as the Messenger of Darkness. He also mentions that she's a 700-year-old woman, which we already know who that is. Yukihime arrives right then, but the other girl quickly identifies her as Evangeline and initiates an attack. However, the waifu easily intercepts it, and she quickly recognizes him as one of the Shinmari. And so, we learn that he comes from a clan called Fushigari, which is dedicated to hunting immortals, claiming they are villains and all that stuff. Although, he was somewhat mistaken. Anyway, just when Kurumaru was about to launch another attack, our waifu quickly stops him with a powerful punch straight to the heart. Touta thinks she had finished him off, but it wasn't the case. We then realize that the boy was also immortal. So, Touta tries to wake him up, but it was of no use. When he went to check if, well, the guy was a girl or what's going on, he suddenly wakes up and quickly becomes aggressive, saying he has to finish off Evangeline because his brother asked him to, and it was part of his mission. In fact, if he didn't, his brother told him never to return home. Anyway, the blonde girl tells him that if he wants to fight her, he would first have to battle the protagonist. Kurumaru quickly accepts, but Touta sets a condition. The winner would do whatever the other decides. Well, the match begins, but Touta manages to dodge all of Kurumaru's strikes. When out of nowhere, he ends up splitting the protagonist's head open. However, since Touta is quite the skilled fighter, he manages to heal quickly and delivers a powerful blow, sending Kurumaru flying. Kurumaru then thinks that he's going to do something perverse to him, but Touta tells him that he just wants to be his friend. And well, after all this mess, in a scene change, we see that everyone arrives to the hot springs, but nothing important happens. We just find out that the tiny person with the protagonist was none other than Yukihime herself, who uses magic to appear a bit older, purely physically, since, well, you know she's 700 years old. After this encounter, Kurumaru reflects, realizing that he had found a place where he truly belonged. As they walk, the blonde girl tells him that she could accept him as her new apprentice. On the other hand, after walking for a while, they all think it would be great if all the immortals helped each other, so they propose to form a group and go out searching for all the immortal people who exist to recruit them. But right then, Yukihime starts laughing at him. Suddenly, many cars appear, and many people come out to greet the blonde girl as if she were a goddess. She tells them that she had already created the immortal organization called UQ Holder. After that, we see Touta and the others on a ship heading toward the organization's base. At this moment, the waifu, Yuki Gimi, talks to a girl in a red uniform who seems a bit annoyed because the waifu had brought along that stupid protagonist. The blonde girl tells her to calm down a bit because both she and the protagonist are the most powerful people of all. So if the world were to end, they would be the only survivors. Obviously, the girl didn't like that very much. Anyway, once they arrive at the place, this guy tells them that this entire area is the organization's base. We also see that many guys who look like bodyguards are very happy that the waifu Yukigimi has returned. On the other hand, this man, whose name is Makabe, explains to our protagonists that there are different types of immortality. Some use magic, and others even live their lives as if they were in a video game. The thing is that they are offered to be part of the organization, and they obviously happily accept. However, they are told that things wouldn't be so simple because, to join, they would have to pass a test, which involves fighting hand-to-hand against them. If they managed to land just one hit, they would be in the organization. The waifu receives a report saying that Karim will fight against the protagonist and Meakab against Kurumaru. We see that Touta tries to land a surprise hit, but he quickly receives a powerful blow. Both spend some time trying to attack, but without any success. We see that Kurumaru fights with her sword, but the guy dodges everything, until a waifu, with her incredible strength, trips and falls in front of the protagonists. Being the gentleman that he is, Touta decides to help her with her things. So there, the girls are told that she was just a regular human who worked at that place, and well, due to a series of events, she ended up there. Her name is Yuki, by the way, and our guy tells her that he would help her with any pending tasks she has. On the other side, we see the blonde and the redhead recalling the past when this boy had approached her to ask for the same test the protagonist is doing. Remember? The guy with the powerful sneeze. Also, it shows that the redhead had several people backing him up. The waifu tells us that redhead person was the protagonist's grandfather. After this, we see our guys carrying boxes in a warehouse, but they kind of don't know where they are and end up getting lost, finally arriving at this place where, after walking a bit, they find a buried sword. They also encounter this guy called Holder Number 2, who is a really good guy. His name was Chilido, and he quickly tells the protagonist to try to pull out the sword because he had noticed that his companion had one, but, well, he didn't have any. The protagonist at first didn't want to take the sword, but after being convinced by him, he tries to pull it out. He said it was really difficult, but then, out of nowhere, he hears a voice that tells him to turn a knob, which he does, and ends up easily pulling out the sword very easily. This obviously surprises Chilido, and they all realize that the sword was talking. It tells the guy that he is kind of chosen to use it. Then, the old man asks for the sword, and the protagonist adjusts the knob again, and when he gives it back to him, it leaves a giant hole in the floor. You might wonder what happened, right? Well, it turns out the sword had an adjustable weight feature, so when you turned the knob, it got much heavier. The guy tells them they should train there during these days to improve and beat their rivals. That's how we see them training hard and helping Yuki in their free times. So, 7 days go by, which is just the time limit they had to try to pass the test. Well, first, the fight begins with Kumaro, where the guy with glasses recognizes that they have significantly improved their strength and tactics, but they still have a lot to improve. We quickly see that the fight gets complicated for him because, despite being very skilled, as the guy with glasses says, his attacks are very predictable. On the other hand, the protagonist talks to Karim, who tells him that this time he wouldn't do any surprise attack, and he quickly attacks her with his fully charged sword. Kumaro is in a bit of trouble, but ends up devising a plan where, in this way, he manages to defeat the guy with glasses. Meanwhile, the protagonist almost had the girl defeated when, out of nowhere, he hears a scream from Yuki, and he doesn't care about the fight anymore and runs towards her. There, we see some giant monsters where, together with Karim, they manage to save the girl. And not only that, but after everything had passed, they tell the protagonist some good news, which is that he had passed the test. And that's how they both get their first mission, to eliminate all the enemies that had infiltrated the base. Well, that's how another day goes by, where now the blonde guy gives their real first mission to our protagonist, which would consist of accompanying Karim to a human city. There, we see them running towards the place, where they kind of explain that over the years, poverty has greatly increased in the world, so these poverty zones are called slums. The bigger problem is that there are people who seek to eliminate all the poor in the world. So, as Karim, Yuka, and Holder say, they are an organization that not only consists of immortals, but also seeks to help other people living in poverty, as well as to avoid the constant threats from the rich. The main characters arrived at the place, and he kind of thinks that these guys in black were the bad guys, but no, they were just people from the organization. So everything is fine. Then some time passes and they engage in an arm wrestling competition where everyone ends up beating the poor protagonist who, after losing, has to cook. Though he surprises everyone with his great cooking skills, and even Karim admits he has a talent for it. During this, she recommends that if he wants to beat them in arm wrestling, he should practice a move called lightning step. On the other side, we see the three waifus talking, and Kurumaru realizes that life in that place is tough, so she is convinced to do her best to help them. Back to the protagonist, he starts practicing this lightning step by running really fast around the place. But then, from afar, this guy observes him and approaches the protagonist to tell him that this is not how the move is done. For example, the protagonist was kicking up a lot of dust when he moved, and other technical stuff. The guy shows him the correct move, showing us that he literally teleports and positions himself perfectly. He is also surprised to hear that the protagonist had only started practicing that same day because, well, he had taken years to learn it. Still, the protagonist doesn't quite understand why the heck this would help him win in arm wrestling when suddenly the other guy lands a big hit, explaining that the feet are fundamental to winning. So, the protagonist starts practicing a lot, even cooking with his feet, and everyone can see that he is taking it very seriously. In fact, this other guy is motivated to train with him, so now they are practicing together. But we didn't know that the guy who was teaching the protagonist could transform into a werewolf, and he was with these two guys, who are a group of bad guys, looking to eliminate the immortals. In that moment, Karim was bathing when this guy appears behind her, although the waifu manages to hold her own, but not for long. On the other hand, the protagonist is with the young guy he was training with, when they see that they are attacking the area from afar because there were a lot of fires. Suddenly, they were about to be attacked, but Koromaru arrives and helps them. However, this doesn't last long because the werewolf and the other bad guy arrive. The wolf finds out that the protagonist is an immortal, but he also tells him that it won't be much help, making a very strange attack that leaves the protagonist completely paralyzed. Meanwhile, Kurmaro manages to fight the wolf a bit, but she quickly ends up being completely defeated. She realizes that the protagonist was paralyzed by some strange magic, so now they were really screwed. But when the werewolf was about to take out Kumaro, the guy who was training with the protagonist intervenes. On the other side, we see them telling a story that many years ago, a witch ended up being burned in a village, but she wouldn't die. One day, out of nowhere, a young man ended up taking the girl. We realize that the person who took the girl was Karim, who is still being attacked by the bad guy. By the way, he spends a good while talking bad about her, and on the other side, back with the boy, he can't do anything to the wolf as expected. So the next thing he would do would be to finish him off. But just then, kind of out of nowhere, Kumaro tries to save him, but the one who stops the blow is none other than the protagonist himself, who stands firm before killing him. Before doing so, Karim lands a huge kick in the bad guy's groin, and she kind of gets a power-up, completely taking the guy down. And well, now, what we were all waiting for, the protagonist also gets a big power-up, and now his arms are completely overpowered. He lands a punch that literally sends the guy almost to the lobby. This more than scares the wolf, it excites him, as he wanted to fight more against the protagonist. Just then, Karim arrives, and the protagonist realizes that the werewolf was the guy who was training him. Anyway, they both continue the fight, exchanging punches, and then, out of nowhere, the guy unleashes more power and ends up making a huge hole in the protagonist's chest. Literally, he left him a hole like she left my heart. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the protagonist gets another power-up, manages to stand up, and the other bad guy in front of Karim says that power could only be Erebea magic. In that moment, he tells us that only two people have ever tried to create this power. One of them was Yukihime, who had failed, and the other was the waifu's disciple, who succeeded. Well, that's how the protagonist gives a big blow to the bad guy, then continues to land several blows. The bad guy says he gives up and prepares to be finished off, but the protagonist manages to stop himself, making him come back to his senses because with the power-up he got, he had kind of stopped being himself. Now, he tells him he wouldn't finish him off because he wanted to keep fighting until he couldn't get up anymore. But the bad guy ends up challenging him to an arm wrestling duel where he flips a coin, and when it lands, things start. We see that the guy took a big lead and almost beat him, but the protagonist preaches to him. The protagonist preaches to him, saying how it's possible that with so much power he uses it for evil. And just like that, out of nowhere, the protagonist pulls out a lot of strength and ends up blowing up the building, managing to beat him. Once everything is over, the town is still on fire, but Yukihime arrives, and with a magical power, she puts out the fire, only to see that the enemies manage to escape. And so, we move on to a new day, where Kumaru has the protagonist's sword, because, well, the sword asked to be taken to the one who had literally forgotten about it. However, while chatting with the sword, it tells him it had noticed he had feelings for the protagonist, which makes Kumaru nervous, and he runs away, leaving the sword behind. The protagonist sees him from afar, and kind of wonders why she feels so strange looking at him. But, well, we all know what's going on here. On the other side, we see our guy chatting with Yuki, who ends up taking him on a ride on her water scooter that she had created. This becomes an emotional moment for the protagonist, and we also find out that Yuki's dream was to compete in a professional race someday, so the protagonist encourages her to follow her dream. Meanwhile, Karim enters Kumaru's room, where finally someone realizes that, well, she's a girl. Oh wow, mystery solved! But Kumaru tells her not to tell anyone, because it turns out that Kumaru is neither a girl nor a boy. From where she came, which was this kind of family or whatever, they were trying to eliminate the immortals. So all these people were semi-humans, who, when they reached a certain age of adolescence, chose to be boys or girls. Karim starts a fight, saying she should choose to be a girl, to be with the protagonist for life, since, well, she doesn't trust her to keep hanging out with Yukihime. Anyway, after this, it looks like this blonde guy appears and ends up saying he has a plan for Kumaru, and quickly, we see the protagonist wandering around asking where the hell Kumaru is, when suddenly this beautiful blonde girl appears, who turns out to be none other than Kumaru disguised as a girl. Well, that was the plan of the other guy, although we see that Kumaru's face shows she kind of likes the idea. Anyway, she introduces herself to the protagonist as Kumaru's cousin, and after chatting for a bit, ends up asking the protagonist to accompany her to see the capital, which he agrees to, and they have a pretty good time. On the other hand, we see Yukihime talking to this guy, and she says she is worried because he will appear and look for the protagonist for everything that happened with the weird magic last time. And well, when she says he, she is referring to this guy named Faith. Anyway, the protagonist and the waifu arrive at a part of the tower where, after enjoying themselves for a while, an enemy appears who captures the protagonist in the blink of an eye in the water, and the waifu attacks, getting beaten up, ends up being defeated because being in her female body makes her feel much weaker. However, she doesn't give up and attacks again, but this time, she is captured, just like the protagonist. And now, as she was about to give up, she remembers the encouraging words of the protagonist, which gives her a power-up where, now like the usual Kumaru, she manages to escape from the prison she was in. And well, both she and the protagonist, and since they had already lost a lot of time, the enemies end up fleeing. Then the protagonist wakes up, and right in front of him is Kumaru in her usual outfit, where we hear the waifu thinking that no matter what happens, she or he will always be with the protagonist. How beautiful. After this, we see the blonde guy from earlier talking to this little girl who was doing some kind of ritual. We don't know what it's for, but she says it's for something important and special that's about to start. Then, after this, in a scene change, we see our protagonists with Karim, the blonde guy, and this little girl who, by the way, is named Kiri. And out of nowhere, she asks the protagonist to talk alone, which is a bit weird, but well. After walking for a while, the girl tells him to sit down and then starts giving him some pretty weird orders, besides telling him that he hadn't protected her on 5 occasions, which doesn't make much sense, because, well, he had never seen her before. But then, out of nowhere, the little one is heavily attacked by someone, where the girl tells him to hold her hand, which the protagonist does, and, well, we quickly see that he appears next to the waifu at the organization's base. And seriously, what's going on here? Well, their wave explains to him that he had traveled to the past. The protagonist, not understanding much, ends up getting on this ship with Karim, the blonde guy, and the waifu there. She explains that her power consisted of this time traveling through sand rituals, where if she takes another person's hand, she takes their soul with her, which, well, explains why the protagonist had to hold her hand. Besides that, the little one tells him that she had already gone back 5 times in time, and in none of them had the protagonist managed to grab her hand. Anyway, after arriving at the same place as last time, Kiri again asks the protagonist to talk alone, when out of nowhere, everyone reacts quickly and hits this guy who recovers and tries another attack. This time, the protagonist intercepts it with his OP sword and charges it with a lot of weight and lands a good hit on the guy. After this, the girl explains everything. It turns out that all those times she had gone back in time was because they had captured the protagonist, and all this was done by this white-haired guy named Faith. They have a memory of the waifu, where we see her chilling, talking with Kuramaru, when an explosion occurs, where she sees the protagonist in trouble because this man, Faith, had managed to finish off everyone in the place, and this waifu dies, but manages to end her life and return through time travel. Well, after telling them all this, right then, Karim and the blonde guy appear, who had heard everything that happened, where the protagonist tells them that this girl can go back in time and that she's pretty awesome. But this angers the waifu, and after this, she explains that it's not good to reveal the type of immortality each person has, because in the future, it could be used as a weak point. Anyway, the thing is, everyone manages to give more confidence to Kiri and she starts explaining her plan. We see everyone getting into specific positions to wait for the bad guys, and once they have them right where they want them, they plan to lock them up in a place. Anyway, the protagonist was already prepared when he starts looking for information about the bad guy on his phone, and suddenly, he gets a call from Yukihime who says he was a friend of his grandfather and that a long time ago, the three of them had saved the world from different problems. However, once the protagonist's grandfather died, Faith changed his ways and became a bad guy. But this kind of distracts the protagonist from the plan. But finally, Faith appears among the people. Although the bad thing is that the attack had to be cancelled because right next to the bad guy were the protagonist's childhood friends who, well, once they saw him, they greet him and everything. Despite having cancelled the attack, the blonde guy was going to do it, but he is stopped by this waifu dressed as a maid. Going back to the protagonist, he tries to take his friends elsewhere when Faith shows up, who introduces himself as an old friend of his grandfather, but the protagonist gets defensive, and this makes Faith threaten him with his friends. But out of nowhere, the protagonist gathers his courage and says that since he disliked him from the start, he felt obliged to fight him. So when it seemed like he was going to throw the first punch, he starts shouting at the top of his lungs that there was a bad guy with a bomb in the area. This kind of distracts Faith, and from behind, Kan hits him, and the protagonist also takes the chance and strikes another blow with his sword, but now with a weight of 500 tons, which surprises Faith because he knew how to break his barriers. Then the blonde guy makes a move and manages to activate the attack planned from the beginning, thus generating the opportunity for Kiri to grab the bad guy and lock him up. But for this, the others also had to touch her, and since they weren't careful, Faith ends up petrifying her. Wow, this is getting complicated. We see everyone trying to defend themselves from their opponent's attacks as best as they can. Because if before two bad guys had arrived, now they were fighting against Karim and Kuramaru. The protagonist was giving his best in his fight. But in that moment, Karim calls him and tells him that Kiri had left a counter, and the protagonist tells him to keep fighting until the counter's time runs out. So he does, trying to buy time with Faith, although there comes a time when he has him cornered. But the protagonist increases the weight of his sword, falling right in the middle of all his friends, and when the time runs out, just there, Kiri nullifies herself from the petrification and sends them all to the cave. The plan was perfect. And yeah, these guys are geniuses. Then Yukihime also appears, although in the middle, I want to start a fight, but in the end, they don't. Faith proposes that each person present asks him a question to which he will respond honestly, and once they finish, they'll let him go. They agree and start extracting information, and we end up finding out that Faith needed the protagonist because he wanted to save Negi. The protagonist's grandfather would also save the lives of 12 million people. Then they ask another question. Kuramaru asks what the urgency was in needing the protagonist, to which he replies, there was no rush. Finally, the protagonist says that from what he heard, it seems that he is not a bad person. But then he asks if he was the one who ended his parents' lives, to which he responds, yes. This makes the protagonist so angry that he gets a power-up. Even though he was about to attack, a sort of projection appears, and who else but Negi appears. He tells the protagonist not to believe Fate about what he said, as he truly had no bad intentions. And then Yukihime, through telepathy, tells Kuramaru to stop the transmission. So, when Negi was about to tell the protagonist something about the truth, the hologram cuts off right then. Another day goes by, and we see the waifus talking, where Kiri was angry about all the effort she had put in to ultimately let Fate go. Anyway, Karim ends up realizing that all the others were in love with the protagonist. But hey, people, I'm just saying that the protagonist is slowly forming a harem. After this, we see Touta trying to talk to Yukihime, but she completely ignores Lil Bro. On the other hand, we see this blonde woman arriving at the place looking for Yukihime, and this beautiful waifu looking for Touta. And we see him training with his sword. Obviously, it's a bit annoying because his waifu had ignored him. In that, he ends up meeting Yuki, with whom he ends up having tea while chatting for a while. But there, the other waifus waifus were already spying on him because, well, they seemed a bit jealous. Anyway, out of nowhere, a young blonde girl appears from before. She introduces herself as Mizore and arrives wanting to fight the protagonist. In her words, he belonged to a family of womanizers, saying that his grandfather had conquered the hearts of many waifus, but that was unacceptable to her. So she throws a punch, but the protagonist ends up defending himself and sends the poor waifu flying. But well, he ends up saving her, which makes the waifu fall for him quickly, and the thing doesn't end there. Mizore proposes to the protagonist to be his girlfriend. Wait, what? But the protagonist instantly rejects her. Wow. There's a scene change, and we see Yukihime talking to the blonde lady, reminiscing about their school days and how all the girls loved Negi, and well, the blonde always got jealous and ended up trying to be the best waifu in the place. And, well, back to the present. Mizore ends up preparing lunch for the protagonist, which he really enjoys. While this was happening, the waifus were spying on him when suddenly the blonde guy appears, giving advice to the waifus that if they wanted to make the protagonist fall in love, they had to take him to the hot springs and wash his back. And that's how they would win his love. Now, returning to the conversation between the waifus, the blonde notices something strange with Yukihime, realizing that it was because she was afraid that something bad would happen to Touta. However, she tells her not to be afraid. As Negi always said, the true magic is having courage. Man, this girl is a poet. And okay, moving on to the hot springs, once the protagonist was all chill there, the war begins where, well, they were all fighting until suddenly the one who ends up washing the protagonist's sword was Yukihime. In the end, there we see them arranging to talk later. Once they finish gathering to talk, Yukihime tells him that his grandfather, a long time ago, was possessed by a very powerful villain, and he ended up trapping him with her power, and so he's been trying to survive for over 20 years. And not only does she tell him this, but she also reveals that his parents didn't lose their lives in the accident afterward. He never really had parents, since the protagonist was a clone of his grandfather. Wait, what? Man, after this news he was even left stunned. However, Kurumaru shows up to his room to invite him to a big event in the city. It was an arena battle where the most powerful would be chosen based on the victories achieved. This motivates the protagonist, so he gets happy and goes to sign up for the tournament. In that, we also see waifu Yuki talking to the blonde lady, where our waifu tells her that she told the truth to the protagonist, but she really doesn't know if it was the best decision. And well, returning to our gang, we see that the protagonist unfortunately couldn't sign up for the combat in time. So yeah, quite a bummer, honestly. In that, while talking with Mizore, the lady appears, who introduces herself as Yaka. There are also other waifus who introduce themselves. The green-haired one is named Mana, who says she was the head mistress of the school that was in front of them, where, well, her grandfather had also worked many years ago, and they were his students there. There, Yaka takes the protagonist to get to know the room where classes were held, where they tell us that he arrived as a teacher when he was barely 10 years old. There, in a small flashback, we see how he introduced himself on his first day, where outside, a ghost girl appears, who was also Negi's student. So yeah, finally, Yaka approaches the protagonist and preaches to him a bit, saying that he shouldn't really feel bad for being a clone, as really, if Negi were here, he would recognize him as his grandson. So yeah, the protagonist realizes how much they loved him, where, on the other hand, out of nowhere, Mana receives a call from a contestant who had been injured, which leads our protagonist to step in. And so quickly, we see him enter the combat arena, where he faces this hooded guy named Cutlass, and quickly, the fight turns to the protagonist's advantage, because this guy is not only OP, but also knows that the protagonist was a clone. There, when our guy was already cornered, the protagonist's grandfather, Negi, himself arrives and takes him to the top of the tower. But there, the protagonist begins to question this supposed person's actions, where, after this, we see Yukihime uses a spell that breaks the barrier that had been placed, and we see the waifus arrive, who, along with the others, prepare for a pretty epic fight. Because, as the waifu says, he's not Negi, but none other than the mage of the beginning. Remember, the one who cast a spell on Negi. Things get complicated, because besides this, more enemy allies appear, who are super OP, according to what the waifu tells us. When the fight was about to begin, we see that our protagonist is somehow transported to another place, where, in the distance, waifu Yuki is lying on the ground because she seemed very injured, and when the protagonist tries to help her, she is again transported to another place where she finds this guy, who by the way is the creator of his sword. But well, he tells tells him that he has the mission to convince him, and that, according to them, there we are shown the story of Yukihime and how one day she fell in love with the protagonist's great-grandfather, who was also named Negi, and we saw that over the years he died, and the waifu took Negi as a disciple, the protagonist's grandfather, but over time she also fell in love with him. In that, the protagonist tells the bad guy that he hasn't changed his mind about anything when, out of nowhere, the mage of the beginning appears, presenting herself as Lalda. There, we see her trying to attack Yukihime, but the protagonist protects her, where she reveals that she'd stayed alone because she was tired of walking alone through life, as she was always left alone as the years went by. There, the protagonist, like a true Sigma, tells her that he will always be her companion. And, after this, the waifu, who was already kind of recovering, tells the protagonist that he has his chance to fight against the hand. However, the mage ends up setting mental traps for them, where the waifu sees Negi and Touta, his friends, dragging him to the bottom of the water. But suddenly, a waifu appears to the protagonist, who quickly punches a sort of wall and reveals a beach. There, she introduces herself as Hazuna, saying that she was his grandmother. Wait, what? This girl, as we can see, is very powerful and ends up giving the protagonist's group information to be able to return to the initial battle and win it. So, out of nowhere, they return and everyone starts attacking, thus managing to reach the cheap copy of Negi. The protagonist gets a power-up and manages to stand his ground. We see the others buying time against the enemies, but then, when Touta is out of strength, Yukihime and Fate appear to help him. It's then that, with a strange power, Fate reveals to us the true Negi, who was in his child form, and Faith tells him about his plan to save him and humanity. He wanted to make everyone immortal so they wouldn't suffer, but Negi refuses and tells him that his plan could only be achieved if he died because, in reality, his soul was part of the mage of the beginning. This makes Faith really sad, and when there was little time left, Yukihime hugs him, but all of this is suddenly interrupted by fake Negi, who had powered up and quickly removes Fate and Yukihime from the battle. However, the protagonist, just like fake Negi, had badass power up. This way, we see them fighting for a while, but the protagonist reaches a point where he manages to land a heavy blow right in fake Negi's face. However, another villain arrives and leaves his sword stuck there. We see that they were about to finish off the protagonist, but out of nowhere, Kiri intervenes, telling them that they're done for because they know if they hurt her, well, she could turn back time. But then this villain ends up injuring her anyway. However, the waifu smiles at the protagonist, saying everything was going according to plan. That's how suddenly the fake Negi appears in front of all these waifus who start attacking him non-stop. We even see the waifu Yukihime in her child form throwing more attacks at him. Nevertheless, the waifus fully explain that they lived in the protagonist's memories, and that's why they were helping him now. And the villain Negi tells them that's impossible because the protagonist only had the genes of Asuna and him, to which the waifu replies, that's not the case. Out of nowhere, Asuna appears and tells him she's sorry for leaving him alone all this time. She also tells him that now she would join him, and that would give everyone a little more time. Then, surprisingly, fake Negi accepts and leaves the place, allowing everyone to survive. After all this, one day, out of nowhere, Touta shows up to declare his love to Yukihime, telling her he wanted to protect her for life and even wanted to marry her. But the waifu tells him no, so the good guy might not have ended up with the waifu, but he did end up with a tremendous harem. Oh man, some people just get all the luck. Drop a like and a subscription if you enjoyed this story and watch this one next. That is also pretty epic.